Good day, my name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth WA-ASEAN Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second day in our series of daily virtual dialogues as part of the third annual Western Australia ASEAN Trade and Investment Dialogue. Many of you will know that we convened this at a large scale last year here in Western Australia and the year before as well. This year, we're delighted to be able to do things virtually, to correspond and to interact directly with our colleagues within the region, as well as colleagues throughout Australia in this Zoom format. We appreciate you all for taking the time to join us. Today, we're focusing on agribusiness. We're looking at Australia's abundance and ASEAN's need, the long-standing trades in agribusiness between Western Australia in particular and our nearest neighbors, but also the potential for that to grow despite the current disruptions to the global economy and the COVID environment. I'm joined today by Minister Peter Tinley, who in his position as Minister for Asian Engagement has really been the inspiration behind this series for the last several years. Minister Tinley, I think most of you know, has been a member of our parliament here in Western Australia for the last 10 years. He's Minister for Housing, also Minister for Fisheries. We're going to be talking about that today, but really in his profile as Minister for Asian Engagement has been responsible for Australia's strategy and particularly Western Australia's Asian engagement strategy and our efforts to reach out to strengthen ties with the various member countries within ASEAN. We're going to start today with a short video. After that short video, I'm going to turn the time over to Minister Tinley for some opening remarks, and then I will come back to introduce a panel which will take us through the rest of the hours for a panel discussion on the topic today. So we'll start the video now.
Western Australia is highly regarded internationally for its premium quality and safe agri-food and fisheries products. With extensive pristine coastline, fresh rivers and clean oceans, our unique location makes Western Australia attractive for sustainable aquaculture investment and production.
We have established aquaculture development zones, hatcheries, research facilities, all ready to go. So we can take advantage of this growing global demand for clean, green and sustainable seafood.
There is opportunity to be involved in early stages of development to plan and capitalise on the future growth of Western Australia's aquaculture. To invest or develop into our aquaculture markets, we invite you to contact the Government of Western Australia's Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development or Overseas Trade Office to see how your aquaculture project can be developed on our shores.
It's really a great pleasure to be here again, day two of this. It's as well, it's quite emblematic, I suppose, the fact that we're meeting virtually in these times, emblematic of the times that we live in, and 2020 particularly. I think I speak for everybody who's listening that we'd be very happy to see the back end of 2020 and the front end of well, hopefully a vaccine-filled 2021 to assist us to get where we need to go. Western Australia sits at a tipping point, in my view, particularly around this topic we're going to discuss today, but around our relationship with ASEAN as a nation, but certainly Western Australia's role as being the sole representative of the Commonwealth of Australia into the Indian Ocean and into our time zone. And we understand in Western Australia acutely the opportunity that exists 3 and 5 hours flight time or beyond that even in our north of where we're sitting right now here in Perth. It does genuinely, for me, feel like we're at a very close point with ASEAN particularly, where ASEAN may well, in our next year or two, come of age, if you like, and have a genuine role to play. Well, we know it's always had a genuine role, but an increasing influence representing a bunch of like-minded countries that want to engage with each other and create a better opportunity for all of our communities. So I do appreciate the Perth WA-ASEAN Centre running this dialogue again. We're very happy with our partnership with them, and they've done a fantastic job, not only in their own right, but also as an asset to government here in West Australia and nationally, I might add, interpreting the world in a way that as it intersects and influences the way we live. The topics for today are particularly interesting because they're talking about the changing nature, if you like, of the consumer demand, both in the ASEAN countries, as we see a rising middle class with genuine discerning tastes and desires that make them very much part of the trade relationship. We're also talking about the supply side opportunities for Western Australian agribusiness, particularly in the spaces of aquaculture, for example. Protein demand has not diminished and will continue to increase over the coming years. And alongside that, if you like, or underpinning that, is also food provenance, ensuring that the origins of food are understood both by quality and safety. And Western Australia and Australia generally sits quite at the core of that, and providing a unique offering, not a volume provider, but certainly a quality provider of value added where possible, or straight raw transfer of export. We're also, though, there's another side to this, which is particularly focused for me as the Asian Engagement Minister, is around attracting inbound investment. Foreign direct investment is fundamental to every economy and its growth, particularly now as we come out of COVID and we launch into a new possibility of the future. So attracting quality investment into Western Australia, either alongside our enterprises or assisting in exploiting our natural endowment here around some of these food products, is vitally important. And I think it underscores, and we'll probably get to it as part of the question, of what role foreign investment plays and how we as a sub-national jurisdiction participate in global supply chains. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Gordon.
Well, thank you, Minister Tinley. The topic today, looking at agribusiness, is one of these issues that can't be discussed in a sheerly domestic context because of the international nature of the agribusiness trade. This is one of the few sectors that have not been as impacted as greatly by the current shutdowns of COVID-19, because the food needs remained, and there's been some tremendous efforts done to make sure that those food exports continue despite the current shutdown of both state and national borders. One of the advantages of the current format that we're using, the digital format for these digital conversations, is that we're able to kind of span the distance. And our panel today is no exception to that. We're very fortunate today to have panelists from northern New South Wales, from Indonesia, and from Thailand, although I think our Thailand representative is calling from Melbourne. We'll work that today. Let me just take a moment to introduce our panelists before we kind of kick off. We're first joined by Dr. Alice Woodhead, who's an inaugural board member of the Australia-ASEAN Council. We were very fortunate last year when we hosted in person the second annual Western Australia ASEAN Trade Investment Dialogue to partner with the Australia-ASEAN Council. And Dr. Woodhead was unable to join us because, if I understand correctly, her home, where she lives and where she's calling into us directly today, is in northern New South Wales. It was under threat from wildfires. And so we're happy that you made it through that period. We're delighted you could join us today. Dr. Woodhead has tremendous expertise in research in this sector. And I think you're going to see, as we hear from her today, her specialty on how you optimize business models, reduce risk in agriculture and food exports, logistics, technology systems, et cetera. So it really is taking a deep dive and a very practical level of expertise to our conversation today. Our second panel is going to be someone who also needs no introduction here in Western Australia, and that's Dr. Frankie Wediyang, who's the head of the PT Bogasari Group. Anybody who's ever had Indomie noodles owes a great debt of thanks to Frankie. He is extremely well known because in his position as head of the Bogasari Group and the Corporate Human Resources Division, where he heads this major agriculture partnership with Australia, he has been directly at the forefront, frequent visitor to Perth, receiver of many delegations that go to Australia, want to pay homage to him in that regard. He serves as chairman of the Indonesian Flour Mills Association. And so given the amount of wheat produced here in Western Australia, somebody who's very important to our engagement. And given the fact that Indonesia is our closest and our largest neighbor, it is very fortunate for us to have Frankie join us for our conversation today. And our final panelist, again, is currently, I think, in Melbourne, but has been based in Bangkok, is Richard Lovell, who's the regional head of CP Foods. Richard got his start in agribusiness working with Thailand's first ever freshwater crayfish farm, but he's now with CP Group as a regional head. CP Group, for those of you who don't know it or don't understand it, is Thailand's largest private company. And they represent 13% of Thailand's overall gross domestic product. So for those of you who are here in Western Australia and watching this, just think of the iron ore sector and the oil and gas industry all rolled into one. That is the CP Group. And so we're very fortunate to have Richard sharing his insights and perspectives with us today. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a relatively informal conversation over the course of the next hour. I've got a number of questions, but I wanted to start off in the order they were introduced to kind of ask our panelists just to take stock of the Australia-ASEAN agribusiness trade in 2020. We've gone through a lot. We're going to start with you, Alice. Obviously, you've had a roller coaster of a year even before the COVID pandemic came about. But would you give us kind of your overview of 2020 agribusiness Australia and ASEAN?
Thank you. Great to be on this panel and to share my expertise. As a member of the Australia and ASEAN Council, our focus has been people to people, as much of Australia's trade is. And what has happened in 2020 is that the people part of the export system, whether it be processing here, getting products on planes, delivering it anywhere in the world, has collapsed. The fish didn't stop growing, the cattle didn't stop growing, and the crops were still growing, but we as human beings couldn't actually work, and this has never happened before. And we've had to develop new types of flexibility that have never been tested before instantly under a constantly changing mat with different circumstances. And because our global supply chains were, and Western Australian ASEAN or Australia ASEAN, anywhere in the world, are incredibly interconnected now. We have processing here, there, everywhere. We were not prepared, and we certainly weren't prepared for the fact that passengers would stop getting on planes, and so our fresh, high value add export, which we've all been working for the last 10 years to move Australia out of a purely commodity-based system, would be under such threat, would in fact not be able to get on a plane. Like who would have ever thought that Qantas would have stopped flying? I mean, that was just a game changer. And we've adapted quite quickly, but we still haven't really managed to work out how we build our relationships when we can't do the people to people, and when our systems are so fallible. South Australia has just gone into lockdown. Heaven forbid which state could go into lockdown, which means that the meat processing plants, which seem to be particularly vulnerable, could all close down. And so that then creates these backlogs. It means you can't fulfill orders. So one of the big challenges is, how do you build trade and build relationships in this extreme uncertainty, which is unlikely to finish in the near future? And I'd like to leave it at that as a starting point, I think, because I think that's the crux of our challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Alice. I mean, the focus on the people to people is extremely helpful, as is an understanding of the linkage between particularly high value added agribusiness and passenger air travel. I appreciate that. Now, Frankie, obviously, a lot of the commodities you've dealt with have come on large ships, not on passenger planes. But Indonesia has had its own particular challenges in the COVID era. Could you kind of give us your assessment of the challenges that you faced in 2020?
Well, thank you, Gordon. I think the key thing is very important. There are changes. Today we have a meeting through virtually. There are changes. That changed the business people. the behavior of business system, probably the business itself are going to transform. The communities or the consumer itself are changing. The changing demand. How do we adapt to all these changes? And these changes is going to go through on and on throughout the condition of the coffee. I think this awareness is very, very important. We don't change, we'll be left behind. So the changes is very important. I think then the key point I think among us in the business is would be that create changes through the digital electronics. So we must get used meeting this way rather than person and person. I think that's one thing. So in terms of the business, so the thing is that if this change is going to happen, then the whole system do change. Means what is very important in the business is the value change. The change, for example, grain change. So the logistic, the value change in the grain, it would be the logistic, the port itself, the unloading port, the income receiving port, okay, the customs decode and the quarantine must be harmonized, and it would be harmonized. It should be through a digital platform. So I think this is the challenge. This is the challenge, and for Australia, which is close proximity with the ASEAN countries or then East Asian or Mid Asia, and I think this is very important. Setting up and harmonizing the digital platform for the grain industries, aqua industries. I think this is one thing. The business, the government are due to harmonize, I think, throughout that. And I would say this would be our challenge in this near future. Notwithstanding, of course, I think with the experience, which is basically Indonesia is one of the biggest importer of grain, and as yet, unfortunately, Australia, Western Australia, it had dropped tremendously. It had dropped tremendously, and Indonesia is one of the biggest importer of grain, wheat grain. The highest is somewhere around 11.5, where Australia is around 45% supplying Indonesia, but due to the failure of crop, to date it's only 1% that is coming out to Indonesia. I don't know throughout Asia, but it's a comeback. Australia had all the advantage on that due to the close proximity. That's number one. And number two, I think the basic, which is Indonesia is one of the biggest flower industries in Indonesia. Okay, at this present moment, probably among the ASEAN countries, and the part of the food industry is there. And flower can be a mean for added value with a combination of the local raw materials. That would be a challenge for us also. So I think the key point would be how to harmonize the whole system among us at the government level and also at the industrial level. How do we harmonize it? The quarantine is very important due to safety. That is a clear demand on that. Okay, so lab system and control system should be harmonized among government. That is what would be requested on that. The same thing, the consumer domestically is also demanding also safety on the food industry, and so the processing industries need to be secured on all its raw material supplies. I think that is what I would put up for the moment, Gordon.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Your repeated focus on harmonization is interesting this week in particular. I think most of you who've watched the media will know that Australia this week signed the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, a free trade agreement throughout our region here in the Indo-Pacific. And the overall theme of that was harmonization, harmonization, harmonization to rule standards. And obviously a long ways to go, but the timing of your message could not be more appropriate. We're going to turn right now to you, Richard. Obviously, your life has been impacted as well. You're not in Thailand today as you would like, but would you give us your 2020 summary of the challenges posed by COVID?
Yeah, sure. Look, there's some challenges because of COVID, and there's also other challenges that have been here for a while, right? I mean, I've been running the CP operation here out of Melbourne for the last 11 years. And obviously with COVID, we've had issues now with obviously air freight, the supply chain affecting different things. Forecasting and budgeting is not an annual thing, or you don't budget for the next 2 to 3 years, you budget for the next 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 3 months. That's obviously something, but some things that have been going on for a while pre-COVID and probably post-COVID as well is, working with suppliers in WA and the rest of Australia to understand the market in Asia and, pick countries out and balance expectations. It's one of the funnest part of my job is trying to get both sides of the demand ecosystem to balance and understand each other. Unfortunately, a lot of businesses in Australia are still very much production focused rather than market focused or demand focused on that side. And I think one of the really bad sides, obviously there's a lot of bad sides because of COVID, but one of the worst things that we see in terms of the business of going forward is the innovation and creativity has come to a halt on a lot of things because we're all focusing on the day-to-day job and the innovation side suffers. So there's a few different challenges, but as I said, some because of COVID and some have been sped up. Obviously flexible working has been sped up. Now we're all used to working from home or partly in the office at least. So yeah, that's some of the challenges we have now.
Tinley, if I can turn to you. Richard just talked about how WA in particular, but I think probably Australia more broadly, particularly in the era of COVID, tend to focus on the production side of things rather than focusing on the demand side of things, on the market itself. Kind of what would be your advice for West Australians interested in expanding agribusiness in Asia? My guess is the whole idea of an ASEAN trade and investment dialogue is about getting us to focus on the market, on the demand side of things. But welcome your insights on that.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that. Good. And Richard, thank you for that point. And the other two panelists, there's two very important other themes they put in around harmonisation and the logistics challenges that we currently find in 2020. One of the things that's happened is whilst Richard talked about the fact that innovation has sort of leached out a bit, what actually is also happening is there are companies that are inwardly focusing here in West Australia. I know this is an Australian example as well, and saying, well, what do we need to do to adapt or die? And the adaptive sort of nature of businesses is fundamental. We know that's how we develop them. And so your point, Richard, around market orientation and that old adage, what does my customer want? And one of the things that I think is really important, Alice talked about it as well, is the changing nature, and Frankie, you also talked about it, the changing nature of the market. I was saying yesterday in our webinar yesterday, I was talking about there's some adaptive things that have happened in the marketplace in various countries, and they're not all equal, but distribution systems internally have been disrupted and changed. Consumer tastes and consumer attitudes have changed. We don't necessarily have enough intelligence yet. And our friends at Austrade and DFAT and our own trade commissioners and most importantly, our business community here that does engage with those markets are great sources of sort of intelligence to understanding what's happened, what's changed about our market and how do we adapt to it, both in the logistics context, but also in the market. taste and demand model. But so the key point for me is making Western Australian businesses understand that to actually engage with these markets and get opportunities out of them, you've got to do two things. One is look at yourself differently, and in so doing, you look at the market differently. But then two, look at about the changing way that business is being conducted. And this is Frankie's point about harmonisation is coming via RCEP and those sorts of things. And it's glacial, I get it, but it takes time. But also understand the fact that the opportunity exists for us to collaborate as competitors here, to partner, to get scale and go into these markets and create a better outcome for us. And the other thing that they need to understand is we're part of a global supply chain. So don't own the whole end-to-end supply chain, see which bits work for us and work the best on the value add side. And that's where we'll drive it. From a government perspective, and my final point is that we will only measure any trade and investment relationship on the basis of jobs. It's a fundamental issue for us, as it is for every jurisdiction. We want our people productive and engaged in employment. So that's the metric by which we view these things. So the sort of programs that we wrap around and the sort of effort we put in as a government is fundamentally orientated towards how do we grow jobs. I mean, there's a whole bunch in that about how we engage with our trading partners and our near neighbours particularly, but there's a whole lot of work and opportunity there.
So thank you all for appreciating that. That was a really good kind of overview of the fundamental challenges of this era, of this day, what we're facing on today. So based on that, I want to kind of move the conversation to hopefully a more positive direction. And that is, given the collective expertise in our panel, what would you recommend for moving us forward, the next step? So we're still probably till the end of the year in lockdown. It's probably going to be another year, it seems, before we have that any resumption of meaningful air travel that you talked about, Alicia. Frankie, obviously the dynamics you were talking about haven't changed dramatically, are not likely to. So if you're a West Australian business and you're interested in expanding agribusiness with ASEAN, what are the things that they should be doing today to forge those relationships, to kind of prepare for a post-COVID era?
Yeah, look, I think that there's some really interesting points that have come out in the discussion, and thank you, Minister, for raising some highlights. I agree, jobs, and one of the challenges with value adding is that we've offshored a lot of it, and some value adding we can do better here in Australia than we don't need to offshore it. And I think an investigation of a product, thinking through, well, really, why are we sending nothing against CP Foods, but why are we sending a whole fish to Thailand to be tinned in Thailand and exported to the world? What could be done here with some of the fish to add that value, smoking it, etc., that then change it into a higher value product for export? So instead of being a commodity exporter, and I'm only picking on fish briefly, but you can say beef or any other product, say you take 10% of that product, can you develop a range of products that can therefore be developed in Western Australia that provide more jobs and deepen the Australian brand in terms of localized, geographically placed, safely packaged products? And one of the challenges with the vegetable market, for instance, is that it is very time sensitive. But when, for example, you smoke a fish and put it in a sealed packet, it can then go by sea, but it is a high value add product. So there is actually a sweet ground in the middle with a lot of products, like, for instance, beef can be smoked and turned into various jerky products, which are very desirable in many parts of Asia now and sought after. And so they can be more locally, regionally branded products that help local producers to add value, but are going to export markets. But I think one has to be very careful about time-sensitive air freight products for a while, because they, you know, aka the lobster to China, etc. Like you can lose a lot of money having your product rotting on a wharf or an airport somewhere. And it mightn't be due to trade relationships. It might be because they've just had a COVID outbreak there and their processing plant has been shut down, or their transport, you know, it's a very uncertain environment. So developing products shelf stable, but higher value add, I think, so very viable. And just very briefly, one of the works that I was undertaking when I was with the University of Southern Queensland, and I was a professor of ag value chains, was we did quite a bit of work with MLA, analysing their trade in ASEAN. And a lot of their meat was focused on high-end tier 1 cities, Bangkok, Singapore, etc., for Westerners. And it's a minute part of that ASEAN market. And there's a huge opportunity to expand our products into tier 2 cities. And maybe they're not quite as expensive as a ribeye T-bone steak in an elite store in Bangkok. But there's still a massive market that we're not penetrating that requires, as Richard has mentioned, a lot of market understanding and development to penetrate those markets, but not necessarily time sensitive. They need to be more shelf stable products that can deal with the already problematic issues with logistics.
All right, Frankie, we're going to come to you. Any kind of suggestions or ideas you might have, given the environment we find ourselves in today, how we can go forward?
That one thing which is a long time I keep on continually suggesting to Western Australia is extending arms. Put a hub near as possible to the market. That is one thing. Having a hub or your grain terminal. Yeah. Go to a nearer, probably somewhere in an island near Singapore or Malaysia. Then you are servicing across over there. That is number one. The product would be an added processed locally with an added value with the local components. Noodles is being exported also out of Indonesia, okay? But that what would be the advantage? Is the added value of the local. The mean would be the flowers. The mean media would be the flowers. There are other things. Chocolate, which is in Indonesia also. So it could be a mix on the processed food. So there are two things that so the grain is important for further added values within the region. There are industries which is processing in the ASEAN region. I mean, ASEAN itself, 600 million people, going up to the up north, East Asia, tremendous. With Asia, food requirement would be continuous. Despite you know, change of climate, we need to adjust. Okay, so there is that what do I mean? It's a collaboration for added values. Okay, then the key is a jointly added value for each country, and it goes all over the world for food processing with the local raw material advantage. I think that, and you do have the advantage of R&D better, okay, developing processing industries in food. You see, so this is a innovation toward the future. And we're going to change. We have to change the policy that we look would be a new way of looking on the overall. Why? There are climate change. There are this pandemic is totally wake us up totally for the changes. So we each of us, I mean, we need to collaborate for both countries, both within the region, both regions. I think this is the way we like to see forward. So that is challenges, but of course we will continuously will talk about we need to harmonize, but zero in the harmonization. What kind of product we want to harmonize first? So it goes on the priority.
So Frankie, can I ask you a specific follow-on question based on Alice's comment that Western Australians and Australians more broadly might focus very productively on second-tier cities? I think probably most Australians could list Jakarta, but few Australians could list, other than Bali, other cities, Surabaya or Makassar or other. So I'm curious as to, given how large Indonesia itself is with 280 million people, what do you think about that focus?
Indonesia is so wide. Islands, I think east to west is 10,000 kilometers, 3 hours. The same of flying from Jakarta to Perth.
Yeah.
I think Jakarta, Perth. I think that is the distance. Abu Dhabi, London, LA, New York. That is the width of Indonesia. It's so spread as an island. So the access of the means the port access is there. I mean, if we bring from Surabaya to Medan, it's just the same as an export to North Sumatra. In between there, you have Singapore, we have Penang, or Malaysia over there. Up north, going forward, we have Thailand. Thailand itself is already near to. So we see the supply chain and the system on that, and you want to be near to build that up. Okay, I can understand, but there is another processing. So it's in collaboration on both. It's depending on each country, right? Which specialty which is chosen. I mean, in the flower industry itself, we have a joint venture. In Indonesia, we have a Malaysian joint venture. We have a Japanese started to have a joint venture in flour milk. Why? Then we need grain on that for export, for added values on that. That's processing, right? Now, we see it from Australia. There is also the importance for, of course, for the Australian communities or the farmers or the development of in Australia. That is a clear exchange. Can be through the business people, but lit up on the harmonization and all the system among the government.
I very much appreciate that. So Richard, obviously, given the scale of your corporation's reach, not just in Thailand, but throughout the region, I'm curious as to your views on this topic.
Yeah, look, I think go back a year ago, I went to Perth this time on a business trip, not just to see my sisters, and I met up with Minister, your DPIRD, your department there, and Joan. And from doing zero to now doing, I think we've done 1,500 tons of beef this year from nothing, from Harvey Beef, to give you an example. Because first of all, we have a great government support, whether it's at the state level or whether it's Austrade in Bangkok. I think that's one area that suppliers here and in Victoria, in WA, wherever it may be, should utilize. I get a lot of people complaining, but compared with some of the bureaucracy around the world, I think what Australian governments do here, the Austrade and the state governments, is fantastic. So that's what I would say to suppliers. Pre, post, during COVID, whatever, that doesn't change. I think obviously it goes back to this thing about understanding your customer and picking your customer. You know, when we sell to Europe, we don't say we sell to Europe, we sell to the UK, we sell to France. When you sell to Asia, pick out your country. Focus on what market you think works and stick with it. Obviously, I grew up in Thailand as a kid from 6 years old. Obviously, I'm not Thai, but after living there, and I know that well, 70 million people, an enormous middle class, an aspiration for great food. You know, they spend a hell of a lot of money of disposable income on food at the same time. So if you think Thailand with the free trade agreement with 0% tax for a majority of items is your market, pick it and go for it. You know, some people go for that, what is it, shotgun approach and just go, oh, I'll just sell to anywhere, or Singapore because I can speak English with them, or whatever it may be. I think that's somewhere where everyone needs to understand to pick and to focus on that and then go for it. You know, that's one. In terms of second tier cities, well, that's all great, but at the same time, you're selling to an importer in a country that's probably based in Jakarta or Bangkok. So it may be good to go to second tier cities, but sitting in Perth or sitting in Melbourne, how are you going to do that? Because your customer on that side is in the capital. You know, the other one is also balancing this demand ecosystem. A lot of Western companies, their staff are short-term focused and incentivized. You know, a lot of Asian companies, you know, like CP, for example, our short-term is 5 or 10 years, not 1 year. And because of that, sometimes when Australian companies are selling to Asia, they're only thinking about the next 3 to 6 months or their KPI for the export manager. And those things don't manage in with the expectations on the demand side, which are talking about 2 or 3 year relationships or building a relationship on that, you know. So that's another thing, you know. And in terms of, you know, Dr. Alice, or whatever we're going to call Dr. Woodhead today, you know, in terms of a conversation on the value adding side, yes, it's all good. I'm actually buying smoked salmon from Huon directly, you know, where go back 5 or 6 years ago, all the smoking was done in Thailand. Now that's more of a fact that value chain, the cost of that value chain is becoming more expensive in Thailand. So to produce that here, it's more likely to work. And also, what's that value, right? What's the elasticity? So if you're going to produce something here and cook it, process it, pack it, what's that value compared to what you could do it in Thailand? And then also the attributes of that value. So if you do produce it here and can gain 20%, but it's going to cost you 40% extra, it's never going to work. And you've just got to wait until the Thai market, whatever market it is, the costs become imbalanced with producing it here. But also at the same time, you know, you can't be good at everything. You know, we can't pretend that we can service every single market, every single product at any single cost. You know, you pick your battles and you go for that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities, but people really need to focus on the demand side instead of, you know, we're Australian, we make a great product, we must be able to sell it.
I welcome your reaction to these three great panelists' comments, but also I'm hoping you'll put on your additional hat. You're also Minister for Fisheries, and this has been a real volatile year for WA fisheries as well. So again, a reaction to next steps, but if you might kind of put a specific WA fisheries tint on that. Yeah, thanks.
Good. I might start where Richard left off and talk about how you pick a market and you go for it. And I really think it's an important commentary around do not see Asia or ASEAN as some monolithic block that you do one deal and you've got it all. It's just not true. It's like trying to even do a deal with Europe is different because you've got to look at the actual specific sub-market, if you like, in this context. So the point that I keep making internally here in Western Australia and sort of nationally wherever I can, Australia needs to go past, and this sort of picks up what Alice sort of is talking about, the value add piece, and Frankie's talking about hubs and technology and those sorts of things. We've got to get away from this idea of trade being a transactional thing. We make, you buy, you make, we buy. Global supply chains have changed. They are continually evolving. They are based on partnerships for mutual outcomes. And so I would say that value adding actually talks about how you're going to participate in that global supply chain, find your point of difference or the competitive advantage, vend it into that supply chain. So rather than go to a target country like Thailand, for example, and do a transactional deal of we've got all this stuff and we want to sell you, who's going to distribute, who's going to buy, and that sort of transaction. Go and find a partner in there that actually would like to invest back up the line, and in vertical integration make a key feature of future supply chains globally, as people trying to shorten them and shore them up as well, particularly post-COVID. What you might find is that you actually get an investor into your business and a partner that will actually access another market. So companies like Burgeoning and CP Foods, for example, I would be saying there's a genuine ambition of the West Australian government is to actually attract you here and say, look, the value add piece isn't necessarily us doing a manufacturing piece of instant noodles with abalone in it or whatever it is. Actually, it might be around the food science that we can contribute to it, the innovation around some of the genetic movements we're seeing in some of the foods and that genetic science. And as Richard said, DPIRD, our agency, and the scientists in there are fascinating to talk to. You can burn a lot of time going down to the labs here in Perth and enjoy yourself talking about people who spent 30 years of their professional life into a particular issue. So as a fisheries minister here, aquaculture is a really good example of where we're looking for investment from our customers rather than investment from just a straight portfolio sort of investor, and genuine FDI that participates in the growth of a business. That's where jobs will come from in a sustainable sense for Western Australia and for Australia. So when we've got challenges like I'm responsible for assisting the lobster industry, and they've had 95% of their output decimated overnight because of the challenges with Chinese trade. Now they chose to do a live export to there because that's where the dough was. That's where the profitability was. Cooked and frozen costs money to do, and then sure, give more shelf life and you can transport it, but the customer didn't want it, that was going to pay the price for it. So they accepted that risk, but we've got to now look at a diversified economy, and you can't diversify economy without diversifying your markets. That means you've got to have deeper and better relationships with those markets and making sure you understand that you're part of a supply chain rather than a transactional model. So lots of challenges. I'll give you one example away from seafood and away from agriculture is in alternate proteins. There is going to be an increasing desire for alternate proteins in these markets. We've got some fantastic grain scientists who have worked on lupin, and lupin is a fairly generic term for a range of subspecies inside the lupin. There's some fantastic stuff. The protein output from a non-animal based or grain based sort of protein, that's enormous, and we need to find a partner. So CP Foods, come on down, and Bogasari, come on down and let's do business.
Fantastic. If I could just give a little bit of I think, due praise to the minister. Many of you may have noticed the West Australian state government has put out an Asian engagement strategy. And historically, whenever you talk to the broader public or even the private sector about Asian engagement, it was pretty simple. We take our product and we sell it to Asia. Very basic business model. And then if you had somebody being a little bit more creative, they would think about, we can sell services too. But one of the things I think was most striking about the Asian engagement strategy was the focus on that more integrated model that the minister was just talking about, which was the investment piece as well. Because once you start to get investment going both directions, the relationship deepens much more than a simple transaction at the border. And it seems to me that in the previous panel's responses, we started talking about that a little bit more, from Frankie's comments on harmonization, et cetera. So I want to go a little bit deeper. If we can take a step back from COVID, we can take a step back from our current situation right now, and we can look more broadly about what are the main elements of a successful WA-ASEAN, Southeast Asian relationship. And then, how do those apply to the agribusiness sector in particular, right? Does it involve the investment? Does it involve the integration, the harmonization, et cetera? And we might go backwards on this one. Richard, why don't we start out with you? If we could get you to kind of get some general principles that we can take away despite the current situation.
I think first of all, pick your relationships. Don't be transactional. I think that's an important point the minister said, a transactional relationship. Understand the demands of the market. Look, when you're looking at high value added items such as abalone, and that one of the biggest issue comes is that the volumes are not there. So a lot of suppliers should look at consolidation. You know, I'm quite interested with Harvest Road, which is Andrew Forrest's business there with Harvey Beef and the mussels, and they're all doing, because that helps with consolidation. So if there's suppliers there of smaller, high value items, to look for other exporters to be able to consolidate to reach a market at a good value. I mean, nowadays, obviously the freight has gone from $1 a kilo up to $4.50 a kilo, you know, and if you're doing smaller volumes, but if you team up with someone, you could be cutting $2 to $3 off a kilo for items into a market. And yeah, I look, and really pick areas you want to look at and develop those relationships. And I think a lot of companies, like I go back on the short-term focus and how companies incentivize their staff to work with ASEAN countries is a key importance. Well, a lot of companies, I believe they have all the good intentions there. You know, the CEOs aren't always on the ground running the sales, and they've got to make sure the sales team are there to understand that this is not a 2-month or 3-month sell. We've got to look for the future for the next 2, 3, or 5 years, you know, on that one. And also, you know, we have a great opportunity that we've got this Made in Australia logo, but that's only one attribute. You know, in CP, we're fantastic manufacturers in Thailand, but we don't have that Made in Australia. We have that Made in Thailand. So we've got to make sure our certifications, our processes are the best in the world, and they are. Sometimes here you scratch the surface of some suppliers and it says Made in Australia, but when you visit the factories, you wonder that, you know, there needs to be an improvement on that side as well. You know, they have to have the whole chain, and we can really make a good business out of some of these suppliers if they focus on making sure they just aren't reliant on that Made in Australia tag. So yeah, and look, I'm always happy to talk to all sort of suppliers if they're interested in the Thai market and how to leverage some of their products to access that opportunity.
Fantastic. Frankie, any insights from anything that you would add in terms of broader principles that you haven't discussed already?
Well, I think the collaboration is very important. I think the key is today we have the Zoom. I think increase the communication probably on the specific association, business association. If it's aquaculture, then we have all the aquaculture people talk each other with Western Australia. It's very interesting the Western Australia developed on the aquaculture also. It's very interesting to see on that. And in terms of for grains, then the association, Food Industry Association, but increase the communication. Group regional, each country's association may have, because the time spending is on the Zoom, basically. So the understanding, identification, what to get things done, and then to get how can we cooperate or collaborate between each country too. And business B2B can be created, and it's just a targeted, focus. Just focus.
You know, one of the themes that I'm confident will come out of our week series of these meetings is that whether you're in Western Australia or in Southeast Asia, we can't wait until the COVID pandemic has passed to begin this process. And so Frankie is maybe slightly more senior than me in terms of age, but to hear him be the agent of change and technology and Zoom and doing things new ways is exactly what we need to hear. So very refreshing. Thank you so much. Alice, over to you. Any broader principles on your part?
Yeah, I just like to pick up on the collaboration and the shared goals, supply chain, value chain. I think that is essential to move ahead, particularly when you're looking at the higher value add products. But one of the roles that our universities can play is more collaboration with ASEAN universities. They have, Bangkok has some amazing facilities for doing products, which CP Foods is very involved in terms of producing products that are regionally flavored and testing them, and they can test the whole of the ASEAN region and China, it's and further afield in terms of helping us to use our raw materials to produce products that are regionally suitable, you know, whether it's we'll stick with fish, but whether it's a smoked fish with a variety of different herbal flavors that suits different regions. So I think the universities or CSIROs or other government agencies have an important role to play in helping industry to develop these products, and it can be part of that building collaboration. The underpinning of this is always the much used word trust. It is a easy said word and not so easy always to maintain when you've got complex supply chains, but if you can consolidate smaller local producers, as Richard was saying, and you have representatives that can have their trust and be the spokesperson for them on the export market, then I think that helps to back up that quality control and helps us to build the sort of scale that we need to go into some of these markets, because it is very hard for one or two small producers in a local area to have the scope to penetrate the scale of and the time and the cost of developing new products, markets, relationships.
We could carry on this conversation easily for another hour. There's much we haven't been able to address, but interestingly, the agribusiness sector has really been front and center in our news. One of the kind of the overarching themes of the Perth US-Asia Center for the last 7 years of our existence has been this broader theme of diversify, 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 to make sure that as a state or as a country or as an individual firm, you don't have all your eggs in one basket. And I think one of the things that led the minister to envisioning a WA-ASEAN trade and investment dialogue was to understand the enormous both complexity but also opportunity in our near neighbors in Southeast Asia. The fact that, again, you've got a collective population of already 600 million people, soon to be pushing 700 million. And the diversity that we've been discussing today, I think, gives us plenty of understanding of that. I'd like to turn to you, Mr. Tinley, for some any kind of final wrap-up comments or insights that you might have before I introduce the next couple of sessions and thank our panelists today.
Look, one of the things, and I really do appreciate everybody's input, and as I said yesterday, and I do in all these things, I learn more than I bring, and it really is an important part of this is making sure that ASEAN dialogue, and that Gordon has been running for us for the last 3 years, has been an outstanding part of our sort of thinking architecture here in Western Australia, because unless you have that conversation, you're not going to get an understanding. And so that's what I've got today immediately, is a sense of understanding. But also, similarly, I understand that we've got so much further to go. Not just us as a small jurisdiction in Western Australia, but us as a nation, and understanding at the base level the nuances, if you like, of the systems and the people, I suppose, in the Asian neighbours. And that work must never ever stop, because in a world that understands each other better, it's going to be a much more secure, a much more prosperous world. And I think in this day and age where there seems to be a retreat to isolationism and nationalism, people people like us need to actually keep pushing on and making sure that everybody and our citizens understand the value of connection. And ironically, nothing underscores connection better than understanding COVID. The pandemic has, and the speed of its spread around the globe is in some ways emblematic of the fact that we are a far more connected world than some of our leaders would want us to believe. And I think it's on us to actually keep pushing along that line.
Well, as much as we enjoy these virtual discussions, and again, and Frankie is exactly correct, we have to change, we have to innovate. We do look forward to the day where we can have you all here with us again in person. Frankie, we look forward to your next visit to what we call Jakarta's southern suburb. We're here in Perth, it's so close. Alice, delighted to have you over. And Richard, glad to have you have family here as well. We hope that you will soon be on airplanes that have their cargo holds full of high value added agribusiness products as we travel between here and the region. Let me again thank our panelists for their insights today. We hope today's focus on agribusiness has been helpful for those who are interested in engaging in ASEAN. I will again remind you that this is the second in a daily series of a week-long webinars, if you will, midday, every day at the same time. Tomorrow, we're going to be focusing on 21st century energy and resource needs. On Thursday, we're going to be focusing on investment, which was a theme today. And then Friday, we're going to be talking about some specific things we can do to rebuild connectivity post-COVID. So on behalf of the Perth US-Asia Center, on behalf of the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, and more importantly, on behalf of Minister Tinley, who's here with us these first 2 days, thank you for your time. As we did yesterday, we're going to wrap up today's session with a specific video highlighting some of the amazing businesses here in Western Australia. In this case, one that coincides perfectly with our topic on agribusiness, Mura Citrus. So thank you. Enjoy the video, and we look forward to having you join us on future sessions.
So we're a family farm. We're the largest citrus producer and packer in Western Australia. Mura Citrus and Northern Valley Packers currently produce about 8,500 tonnes of citrus, and we pack about 11,500 tonnes of citrus. What we're doing is we're packing our own fruit, plus we're packing for other growers as well. And we've also done the first exporting for the citrus industry in Western Australia, and we're now quite a number of years into that and starting to develop up new markets. So it's been very exciting because it's opened up new opportunities. Vietnam for us has really been a success. Until 3 years ago, they had very high tariffs in place. So as those tariffs have been coming down, we've been increasingly been able to supply more to Vietnam. So we've increased our supply levels by a factor of 3 just in the last year. Indonesia's a different story because it's a quota system that really for us is highly dependent upon what the government of Indonesia thinks that they can bring in. They like to obviously look after their local farmers, which we support as well. That's a great thing to see a government do that, but we'd like to get more opportunities in Indonesia. Everyone loves Australian product as well, so we want to be able to do more going forward. For us, the most important thing that we need to be able to do in the export market is diversify risk. From our perspective, being in one market is just simply too risky, because anything that happens in world politics has a fairly big impact on trade that can have a really massive impact on a company that's our size. Mura Citrus's growth plan is to be able to deliver to more markets in the ASEAN area. The ASEAN markets are really important for Australian companies because they enable growth. And then for us, what that means is that we can continue to deliver a great product to those markets as we go forward. We're a perfect example of what the Western Australian companies can offer ASEAN. So we have a really high quality produce, and we have the capacity to provide world-class traceability and food standards. So it's when you're eating a fresh food product, which citrus is, the quality of the food production system is just critical, because the quality of that food will determine the health standards of your family and health standards really then of a country. For ASEAN to be able to access high quality food that's really safe, that's been produced with really high standards, and where we can take you back to part of the orchard where the fruit came from, we think is really critical. The suppliers in those countries know what they're getting from us, the right product at the right price. It's the quality that they know that they need and the quality that they can sell. And that's what Western Australia can offer, because we have those standards, and they're not typically production standards in other parts of the world. So we have an absolute competitive advantage. Proximity of the market is also a key factor. So what Australian, or in particular Western Australia, in terms of accessing these markets can do is we can get the fruit there faster. For Western Australia to be able to access more market opportunities, what we really need is a lot of help and support to understand the markets. So when you're like a small to medium-sized enterprise, Being able to understand 7 markets at once is quite challenging. For us, what we would like to see is more government-to-government cooperation, help around, in-market knowledge, information, contacts, networks, helping us to be able to deal with tariffs or quota systems that may be disadvantaging Western Australian producers. And that has to be done at a government-to-government level. That's not something that a producer in Western Australia can have much influence over. We also just really feel that it's great if this is a priority of the government. When you're a farmer, there's always something going on that's affecting your ability to either produce or get your product to market. And having a really responsive state government and then having the policy settings right at a federal level is really critical.